The morning before my wedding, my mother asked me to sit with her at the kitchen table while the bread was still rising. My younger sisters had been sent to gather eggs, even though we both knew there weren't that many eggs to gather. It was just the two of us, and the kitchen smelled like yeast and wood smoke. And I remember thinking, finally, she's going to tell me something real. She took my hands in hers. Her palms were rough in the way a lifetime of canning and kneading and scrubbing makes a woman's hands rough. And she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between tenderness and exhaustion. Then she said, "A good wife trusts her husband and trusts God. That is enough for you to know." And then she got up, wiped her hands on her apron, and went back to the bread. That was it. That was the whole conversation. 11 words of preparation before the most disorienting night of my life. I was 18. If you're new here, my name is Leah, and this channel is where I talk about growing up in a closed religious community in rural Ohio and the things none of us were ever allowed to say plainly. If any of this sounds familiar to you, I'd be glad if you stayed a while. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribing helps more than you'd think, because it tells me there are people out there who needed to hear it too. I want to say something before I go further, because I think it matters. What I'm about to describe wasn't unusual where I grew up. It wasn't a story whispered about because it was rare. It was the ordinary shape of almost every girl's experience in our community. Some of us were told a little more. A few were told even less. But the silence itself, the architecture of it, was the same for nearly all of us. And that silence didn't stay contained to one night. It followed us into years of marriage, into kitchens and bedrooms, into a particular kind of loneliness that none of us had the vocabulary to describe, even to each other. This is that story. Where I grew up, a girl learned what she needed to know about marriage through 3 unspoken lessons. I've turned these over so many times since I left, the way you turn over a stone you've walked past 1,000 times, finally curious about what's underneath. And every time, I arrive at the same conclusion. There were 3 lessons we were given. They were treated as sufficient, and none of them were true in any way that actually helped us. The first lesson was that a husband's comfort came before a wife's understanding. Nobody said this outright. Nothing about the body was ever said outright in our community. But it was stitched into every sermon about a wife's place, every quiet remark older women made about their husbands, with a kind of weary acceptance I mistook, for years, as peace. It was there every time the preacher read from Ephesians at a wedding, the part about wives submitting as the church submits. The lesson underneath the lesson was simple. He leads, you follow. Whatever he needs, you provide, and your own needs are not really part of the arrangement. A week before my wedding, my Aunt Ruth pulled me aside after a quilting circle. She was the kind of woman everyone admired, raised 9 children without ever once raising her voice that I'd heard, and ran her household like a small, contented kingdom. I thought, if anyone tells me something true, it will be her. She took both my hands and looked at me with real warmth and said, "Be soft with him. Men aren't difficult creatures. They just need to feel like men." I nodded like I understood. I didn't. I had no idea what feeling like a man had to do with the thing that frightened me, the thing I didn't even have words for yet. But I smiled and thanked her, and the moment passed, and that was the closest thing to real guidance anyone who loved me ever offered. The second lesson was harder to name, even now. It was the belief that the less a woman thought about her own body, the more virtuous she was. Modesty wasn't only about hemlines and head coverings. It was a way of holding your own mind. You didn't examine your own wants. You didn't ask questions about your own body, even silently, because asking made the thing real, and realness was dangerous. I grew up believing that a decent girl simply didn't think about her wedding night, that thinking about it at all was already a small betrayal of who she was supposed to be. So I tried not to think about it. And when the fear crept in anyway, the questions with nowhere to go, I pushed them back down and told myself God would explain things when the time came. That was the phrase we were given, over and over, in the same vague, circular way. God will guide you. Trust your husband. Your body will know. Your body will know. I've sat with that sentence so many times since leaving. Because in one sense, yes, a body knows things. It knows hunger and cold and fatigue. It knows the warmth of a hand. But a body that has spent 18 years being taught not to trust its own signals, taught that physical awareness itself is something close to sin, is not a reliable guide to anything. That body has been carefully and patiently trained to work against itself. Nobody warned us about that. Nobody told us we might walk into our own wedding night afraid of our own skin. If any of this is landing somewhere for you, if you grew up anywhere that handed you silence instead of an actual answer, I'd really appreciate it if you hit like on this video. It helps more people find these stories, and there are more people out there who needed someone to say this out loud than you'd guess. The third lesson was the quietest, and I think now the cruelest. We were taught that a husband's patience was a fragile thing, and a good wife never tested it. In practice, that meant if something hurt, if something was confusing, if something felt wrong in a way you couldn't name, the correct response was stillness. A good wife didn't complain. A good wife didn't make her husband feel he'd failed her. A good wife simply endured whatever the night brought and carried on the next morning as if nothing had needed enduring at all. My closest friend growing up, a girl named Miriam, married at 19. She was gentle in a way that made the whole room softer when she walked into it. The kind of person who remembered every child's name and every widow's birthday. Years after we'd both left the community, she told me what her own wedding night had actually been like. She said the hardest part wasn't the discomfort or even the confusion. The hardest part was that her husband, who she believed truly was a kind man and never meant her any harm, fell asleep right afterward. And she lay there in an unfamiliar room in the dark with absolutely no framework for what had just happened to her. She didn't know if it was supposed to feel that way. She didn't know if the strangeness she felt meant something had gone wrong, or if this was simply what marriage was. She told me she stared at the ceiling until the light came up gray through the curtains, and then she got up and made breakfast and said nothing at all. Because that was the third lesson taking root exactly as intended. A good wife's silence was proof of her faithfulness. Miriam carried that silence for almost a year before an older woman in her church, never directly, because nothing in our world was ever said directly, mentioned something sideways about how she kept oil on her nightstand. A look held a half second too long. A door cracked open just wide enough for Miriam to finally walk through it. Almost a year, because nobody had told her the door existed. My own wedding was held at my parents' farmhouse on a Saturday in September. Nearly 200 people came, filling the front rooms and spilling out onto the porch and into the yard under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. We'd spent 3 days cooking. Roast chicken, scalloped potatoes, dozens of pies cooling along every flat surface in the kitchen. The house smelled like browned butter and coffee, and something underneath all of it that I can only describe now as the smell of people who genuinely loved each other, crowded into too small a space. The service itself ran long, the way they always did. The preacher spoke about building a marriage on the right foundation, about what a husband owes his household and what a wife owes her husband. I sat in my new blue dress with my hands folded in my lap and listened. And underneath the listening, I kept circling back to the kitchen table from the morning before. 11 words. A good wife trusts her husband and trusts God. That is enough for you to know. By the time Eli and I were finally alone that night, I had been awake for almost 20 hours straight. My feet ached up into my knees. My face hurt from smiling at strangers all day. The room was simple. A bed frame Eli had built with his own hands the winter before, a quilt his grandmother had pieced together in shades of green and cream, a basin of water on the dresser, and one oil lamp throwing long, soft shadows across the walls. Eli sat on the edge of the bed and undid his collar, and when he looked at me, I realized we were both, in that exact moment, equally terrified. He had been given almost nothing either. His father's entire conversation with him, he told me much later, had been about responsibility and providing and leading well. Nothing about the room we were sitting in now. Nothing about the girl across from him, whose hands he could probably see were shaking. We were two people handed a life together and pushed into a room with no instructions, no map, and a quiet, unspoken expectation that we'd figure it out somehow on our own. What happened that night wasn't cruel. Eli was careful in the particular way a person is careful when they genuinely don't want to cause harm, but have no real idea what harm might even look like. There was confusion I hadn't expected. There were moments I wanted to say something, anything, and didn't know if I was even permitted to. Because that was the whole lesson, wasn't it? A good wife trusts. A good wife doesn't test patience. Your body will know. My body didn't know anything. My body was asking questions nobody had ever bothered answering. Afterward, Ellie pulled me close in the dark and asked, quietly, if I was all right. I said yes. It wasn't exactly a lie. I was all right in the sense that I was still there, still breathing, still myself in whatever shape that meant. But I was also all right in the specific way you say you're all right when you simply don't have the words for what you actually are. When the only vocabulary you were ever given was endurance and trust and submission. And none of those words quite mean all right, but none of them quite mean the opposite either. We lay there a long time, the lamp burning low, the ordinary night sounds of the farm drifting in through the window, indifferent to everything that had just shifted. I didn't sleep for hours. 2 years after I left the community, after the quiet, total kind of distance that comes with leaving, unanswered letters, a phone number that simply stopped being picked up, I started seeing a counselor in town, a woman with a cluttered office full of plants and a patience that never seemed to run thin. In one of our early sessions, I told her about my wedding night, not dramatically, just plainly, the careful way you describe something you've never once put into words, testing each sentence to see if it can actually hold what you mean by it. She listened without flinching, without the particular kind of pity that somehow makes you feel worse than the thing you're describing. When I finished, she said something I've never forgotten. She said, "You weren't left unprepared because nobody loved you. You were left unprepared because the system needed you to be." I sat with that for a long time afterward, because she was right. A bride who understands her own body, who has language for her own experience, who believes her comfort actually matters, is a much harder person to keep quiet. That woman asks questions. That woman might say, "Wait," or "I'm not ready," or "This doesn't feel right." And a woman who says those things out loud is a woman a closed system can't fully hold on to. The silence I grew up inside wasn't really modesty. It was structure. It held the whole system up. And it had been handed down so carefully, mother to daughter, generation after generation, that nobody in that long chain ever stopped to ask whether it was kind, whether it was honest, whether it bore any resemblance to what love is actually supposed to feel like. If you've stayed with me this long, thank you. Stories like this aren't easy to put into words, and they're not easy to sit with either. If you'd like to hear more, subscribing genuinely helps, because every person who finds this is one more person who gets to hear something true instead of just silence. I want to say one more thing before I close this out. I'm not telling this story to make anyone angry at the community I grew up in. I left with things I still carry gladly, a work ethic that's gotten me through every hard year since, a sense of belonging so deep it had an almost physical weight to it, a faith that's complicated now and bruised and rebuilt in a different shape, but still genuinely mine. I don't want to pretend those things away. But I tell this story because what happened to me, and to Miriam, and to nearly every girl I grew up alongside, didn't only happen in one small farming community in Ohio. There are girls right now in other towns, other churches, other families being handed the exact same silence and being told it's virtue. Girls given one short conversation at a kitchen table, or none at all, and sent forward into marriages and rooms and lives they have no real language for. Girls who will lie awake tonight in an unfamiliar bed, asking questions nobody ever gave them permission to ask. And I want every one of them to hear what nobody told me that September. Your body isn't a mystery you should be afraid of. It belongs to you. You're allowed to understand it. You're allowed to have questions. And you're allowed to say, "This doesn't feel right," or "I need more time," or "not yet," and have those words mean exactly what they say. They aren't sin. They aren't immodesty. They aren't a failure of faith or love or duty. They're simply the most basic thing a person is owed. I was 18 years old, sitting across from my husband in a lamplit room with no words for what I needed. I'm not 18 anymore, and I'll keep doing whatever I can to make sure the words exist somewhere, out loud, in a place where anyone who needs them might actually find them. Because the silence was never holy, it was only ever silence. If something in this story found you, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what stayed with you. And if you have your own story and you're ready to tell it, I'm listening, and so is everyone reading along with you. You are far less alone in this than the silence ever let you believe. Until next time, your voice was always yours, even on the nights you were taught to swallow it.